We're hopping on the Ruby hype. We finally got to test it out, albeit in some pretty tricky conditions, and there's a lot to unpack here. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So once again, we're a bit late to the party. It is a little tougher for us to get paddles as quickly as individuals, but we're getting there. So I wouldn't have minded doing a full Ruby review, but there's already plenty of content out there, so I figured we'd do a comparison to the other super popular SixZero paddle, the Double Black Diamond. I've never talked about the DBD that specifically. I've obviously referred to it plenty of times in comparisons and tier lists, but I figured this would give me a good chance to talk about what makes this paddle so good. Now, of course, before we go on, remember that any of the paddles we talk about here, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. And please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So first things first, I want to tell you that I only got to test the Ruby on rainy courts. We're in Vancouver, it's the middle of winter, there hasn't been a dry day in weeks, and there are no hard court indoor courts that close to me, so it's the best we've got. So yes, once again, the footage is going to be kind of funny, although I will say rainy pickleball is very fun, especially once you've got your footing down, although I will admit it did take me a little bit of time to get there. But anyways, let's talk about some specs. Now obviously these two paddles have the exact same shape. SixZero made this famous with the DBD. They're 16.3 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle and have that hybrid shape. The differences start with the weight, and I'm not sure why they're different, but the Ruby weighs 8.2 ounces with a 117 swing weight, and the DBD weighs 8.1 ounces with a 113 swing weight. Little side note on the swing weight, I'm going off of what SixZero claims on their website, but I have no real way to verify it. Our RDC machine is still reading numbers in the 70s and 80s, but we're figuring out a way to move forward with that. Once we do, I'll get some more measurements, especially because I'll be able to batch test to see if these claimed numbers are actually accurate. But anyways, the Ruby is generally a little heavier than the DBD, but honestly, these differences are pretty negligible. Even that swing weight, I didn't really notice on court. The major difference then is in materials used. The DBD is that classic thermoform paddle with a Japanese T700 Toray carbon top sheet, and the Ruby is also thermoformed with an equally top-end DuPont Kevlar weave. We've talked about Kevlar with the Proline Energy S, and it's a very cool material. It's supposed to give a little, but then snap back to its original shape much better after impact. That should, in theory, help with durability and also change playability in some other ways. This was also the first time I was playing with a paddle that has a full Kevlar weave and not a braid of Kevlar and carbon, so as you can imagine, I was very excited to test it out. Let's get into some playability. So right off the bat, I want to say that the differences between these two paddles are very subtle, and I was a little bit surprised about that considering it's a whole different material on the Ruby, but the biggest difference is in feel. That's pretty logical. I mean, if you change up the top sheet, how the ball interacts with the paddle is going to feel different, but we're not talking apples and oranges here. It's not a major difference, and it took me a while to figure out how to explain it, but the Ruby does feel a little more plush than the DBD. When the ball makes contact, you feel like it's going into the paddle a little deeper, and objectively, I would say this feels better just because you have a better connection to the ball with this rich, plush feel. I wouldn't say this has a more premium feel, but compared to the Ruby, the DBD is a bit more raw, and the contact feels more like the ball is crackling in and out of the paddle face rather than really sinking into it and benefiting from that dwell time. So yeah, slightly better feel on the Ruby, but this is interesting because in terms of actual dwell time, they're nearly identical. I can't tell you which paddle is actually softer. I wouldn't even say that that plusher feel on the Ruby implies a longer dwell time. It's just that when the ball is in there, you feel it a bit more. The contact is kind of like ball in, ball out. It's pretty uniform throughout. You never lose connection to the ball, whereas on the DBD, it's a little like ball in, ball out, and somewhere in there you lost the ball. But the actual amount of time the ball spends in the paddle face is pretty much identical. It is super subtle, but I have to say I'm really happy that the Ruby feels like this because I've always found the Proline Energy S a little too muted for my taste, and I thought it was the Kevlar, but now it's making me think it wasn't. Now the Kevlar's plusher feel also has a positive impact on sweet spot size and how the ball interacts with the paddle when you're not making perfect contact. Now I do want to define this term that I'm going to be using a little bit more in my reviews, optimal hitting zone. It might sound a lot like sweet spot, but the optimal hitting zone is where you should be making contact every time. It doesn't get any bigger or smaller with the quality of materials. It's one specific zone on the paddle that's never going to change. Basically, the optimal hitting zone is the best part of the sweet spot to make contact in, but the actual sweet spot expands past the constraints of that zone. A sweet spot can get better and more forgiving with better materials, and that's what the Ruby feels like compared to the DBD. Now again, this is subtle, and I don't want anybody thinking the DBD doesn't have a big sweet spot, because it does. But the Kevlar has that unique ability to pocket and then snap back into position, so when you do make contact outside the optimal hitting zone, the paddle is still rigid and it has good feel for the ball. The DBD has that rigidity, no doubt, the way any thermoform paddle has, but it's the drop off and feel outside of the optimal hitting zone that is way more stark than it is on the Ruby. Now this is all kind of starting to sound like the Ruby is better, but I'm not sure it's that black and white. Sure, having a big sweet spot is generally a good thing, but I kind of like having my paddle tell me when I didn't make good contact. The stark difference in feel in and out of the sweet spot is actually kind of nice on the DBD because it gives you feedback so you can correct your shot in the future, but it's also not too punishing when you do make poor contact. I'm not sure which one I prefer. I think I need to spend a little more time with the Ruby to get used to that bigger sweet spot, but right now I think I'd pick something that has a smaller sweet spot because it has that negative feedback. We're going to talk about spin, and once again, the differences are very subtle. I don't want to say negligible because whatever differences there are very important to the overall experience, but it's hard to say that one is point blank better for spin than the other. As you would expect, because the Ruby is more plush, you get more of that ability to grab the ball and dig into it to produce spin with the paddle's grit. Because of that, this paddle performs exceptionally well for slower paced spin shots, where it's almost a drop shot, but then right at the end you brush up to make it a little more offensive. The DBD is still extremely spin friendly, but it does feel better when you swing with a constant and fast stroke. It doesn't have that same grabby feel, so it won't react as well when you do change up the pace, especially if you want to slow it down. I also think the coarser top sheet on the Ruby does a little bit better for that style of spin than the really fine top sheet on the DBD. This is what we got with original thermoform paddles. They're insane if you're trying to hit with that tennis topspin technique, but paddle technology is evolving, and I have to say that softer, grabbier spin is pretty lethal when you use it right. Now I do just want to say, but it has been said a lot of times, we're talking about two of the best spin paddles on the market right now. What the DBD lacks in that grabby spin compared to the Ruby, it has plenty of compared to other paddles. This is a slightly softer paddle than something like the Flash or the Bread and Butter Filth, so you do still get some of that grabby spin, just not as much as the Ruby. And also, don't confuse the Ruby doing well with slower paced spin shots with it not doing that well if you try to speed it up. This thing has just as much spin as the DBD or any other thermoformed hybrid paddle for serves and powerful ground strokes. Okay, well then if it has more of that grabby spin and the same amount of top end spin, then it might be a little bit better for spin than the DBD, but it's really close. One of the things the DBD did a really good job with was striking the right blend of power to control, at least for a thermoform paddle. We kind of know the deal with thermoform paddles. They're not exactly soft, so they won't help you in the soft game, but the DBD was a little bit softer than its competition, and with that added plushness, the Ruby is even better. It definitely won't be a dinking, dropping, or reset cheat code, but because you have a little bit better feel for the ball, it seems like you also have a little more of that touch micro adjustability. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this is again extremely subtle, but there is something a little more addictive about going for touch shots with the Ruby. I would say compared to other paddles this powerful, it's up there with the top 2 or 3 in terms of control. Speaking of power, these are both phenomenal as you would expect from thermoform paddles. When you swing big, they crush the ball so you can get tons of pace on your serve or any type of powerful ground stroke. The conversation about pop is a little more nuanced. I was going back and forth about no difference and then the DBD being a little bit better. And I will say, I still think the DBD has it beat a tiny bit in terms of pop. That crackly feeling I was talking about might mean it doesn't have the same rich, plush feel, but it does mean it's a little bit more responsive when you're trying to punch away a volley at the net. This is really only when you don't have time to commit to a full stroke, but it does have a bit more of that instantaneous feel where you stick your paddle out, nothing extra, but the ball is going where you point your paddle. It can get a little lost in that big sweet spot and plusher feel on the Ruby, but this is really not a big deal. This is a poppy paddle, all things considered. It would be completely disingenuous for me to tell you that these two paddles are made for entirely different types of players. They're not. In fact, they're so similar that anyone using one can switch to the other pretty comfortably. If you have played with and enjoyed the double black diamond, the SixZero Ruby just feels like it's a slightly more refined version of that paddle. That shouldn't be too surprising. The industry is evolving quickly and improvements in playability can come fast. I don't know if I would say it's an entirely better paddle, but a couple things stick out that make me think, okay, yeah, this is a bit more well-rounded. One, that better feel means that most people will have a better connection to the ball. The only people who might not like this are people like me who like a small and defined sweet spot, but that's so niche that I can't really knock it for that. Two, I can't knock it for it having a bigger sweet spot. In fact, I probably have to give it credit for that. So yeah, that's probably more of a pro than a con. Three, that grabby style of spin is becoming a real weapon in the right hand, so if a paddle can make that a little bit easier, which the Ruby does, that's another benefit. And four, that more plush feel makes for slightly better performance in the soft game, which is the way these new era thermoform paddles are going, and I think that's the biggest improvement. Still, by no means is the Ruby making the DBD obsolete. I think I still prefer the DBD because I like that more crisp feel, but I think if you forced me to switch to the Ruby, I'd be more than happy with it in the long run. Just to finish off though, both these paddles are made for a huge variety of players. We've talked a lot about how well-rounded this hybrid shape is, but in terms of spin variety, user-friendliness, and pretty much everything else, they are top-notch. There is really no one I would not recommend this to, even you players looking for that OG soft control. It might be time to soften up those hands and try something a little stiffer because the other performance characteristics are so elite. With that said though, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo the DBD or the Ruby, you can come visit us in-store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.